What if the gods didn't stop visiting us because they grew tired of humanity, but because they grew afraid of what we were becoming? What if somewhere in the dust of modern Iraq, in fragments held in museum basements and forgotten archives, there are tablets that still carry the minutes of a divine council, a debate that changed everything, a prohibition spoken into the humid air of a temple that has long since crumbled to nothing? The Akkadian texts speak of a cessation, something that was happening between gods and humans that suddenly stopped. Not creation, but something else, something intimate, something that had been ongoing for generations until it wasn't. So before this story pulls you under, subscribe only if you're drawn to histories that whisper rather than shout, that ask questions without offering easy answers. Tonight, we're descending into the archives, into the fragments, into the silence where the gods made their final decision about us. In the ancient city of Uruk, in what is now southern Iraq, there stood a temple complex called Iana, the House of Heaven, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, queen of heaven and earth, deity of love and war and fertility and power. The temple dominated the skyline, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the Mesopotamian sun, visible for miles across the flat alluvial plain where the Tigris and Euphrates deposited their rich silt year after year. Within this temple complex was a structure called the Gipar, the residence of the high priestess, and within the Gipar was a chamber that most citizens of Uruk would never see. A room decorated with elaborate textiles and precious metals and fragrant oils, are dominated by a bed that was not merely furniture, but sacred architecture, a threshold between worlds. Once each year, during the New Year festival, the king of Uruk would enter this chamber, and the high priestess would be waiting, adorned not as herself, but as the goddess she served, transformed through ritual and costume and the accumulated belief of an entire civilization into Inanna herself made flesh. What happened in that chamber was called the Hieros Gamos, the sacred marriage, and the theological texts tell us that upon this union depended the fertility of the land, the abundance of the harvest, the continuation of cosmic order itself. The king would emerge from the Gipar having been touched by divinity, his legitimacy renewed, his right to rule confirmed by the most intimate form of divine approval possible. This ritual was not unique to Uruk. Across Sumer and later Akkad and Babylon and Assyria, variations of the sacred marriage appear in texts spanning more than 2,000 years, always with the same essential structure. A human ruler uniting physically with a divine presence embodied in a priestess, and through that union channeling divine favor into the human realm. Modern scholars have debated endlessly about what actually occurred in these ceremonies, whether the union was physically consummated or merely symbolically enacted, whether the priestess was believed to literally become the goddess, or was understood to be a representative acting in her name. The texts themselves are frustratingly ambiguous on these practical details, focusing instead on theological significance, on what the union meant, rather than precisely how it was performed. But here is what should give us pause as we drift through this ancient material in the quiet hours of the night. The sacred marriage ritual, however it was practiced in historical times, appears to be commemorating something, pointing backward to an older tradition, an older understanding of divine and human relations that was more direct, more physical, more literal than the symbolic ceremonies of later periods. The Sumerian word for the divine radiance that surrounded the gods was Melamu, a kind of terrifying brilliance that marked the boundary between mortal and immortal, a visible manifestation of divine power that could overwhelm human senses and even human sanity. The texts describe Melamu as something that could be transmitted, that could pass from divine being to human through close contact, through favor, through the intimate mingling of essences that the sacred marriage represented. Kings who had experienced the Hieros Gamos were believed to carry a measure of this radiance, to be changed by their contact with the divine, elevated above ordinary humanity by their proximity to godhood. This transmission of divine essence was not merely metaphorical in the ancient understanding. The Sumerians believed that certain qualities could pass through physical contact, that the boundaries between beings were permeable in ways we no longer accept, that a human who touched divinity would be permanently altered by the experience, would carry something of that divine nature forward in their blood and their breath and their very being. And if divine radiance could be transmitted through ritual union between a king and a priestess representing a goddess, what might have happened in an earlier age when the gods themselves, not their representatives, but the actual divine beings, walked among humanity and looked upon the daughters of men with interest and desire? This question hovers over all the sacred marriage texts, like heat shimmer above the desert, distorting what seems clear, suggesting depths beneath the surface that we cannot quite see. Because the Sumerians did not believe they had invented the Hieros Gamos. They believed they were preserving it, continuing a practice that extended back into the time before the flood, the time when gods and humans lived in closer proximity, when the boundary between heaven and earth was thinner and more frequently crossed. The ritual that kings performed annually in the Gipar of Uruk was, in the Sumerian understanding, an echo of something older and more direct, a way of maintaining connection with divine realms that had once been fully open but were now accessible only through ceremony and symbol and the carefully preserved traditions of the temple priesthoods. Let your breathing slow for a moment. Let your awareness settle into your body. Feel the weight of yourself against whatever surface supports you. We are about to descend deeper into this ancient material, into texts that speak more directly about the beings who bridged the gap between divine and human, who carried both natures within themselves, who were the children of gods and mortals born in an age when such things were possible. The Akkadian and Sumerian texts preserve accounts of beings called Apkallu, a term usually translated as sages or wise ones, 7 legendary figures who are credited with teaching humanity the arts of civilization in the time before the Great Flood. These were not ordinary humans who happened to possess great wisdom. The texts describe them in terms that make their hybrid nature explicit. Oannes, the first and greatest of the Apkallu, is depicted in reliefs and described in texts as possessing the body of a fish combined with the form of a man, capable of living both in water and on land, speaking with human voice, but carrying the knowledge of divine realms. He emerged from the sea, according to the Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in the 3rd century before the Common Era, but drawing on traditions thousands of years older. And he taught humanity, writing and mathematics and agriculture and law and temple building, and every art that distinguishes civilization from mere existence. Each day, Oannes would emerge from the Persian Gulf and teach the people gathered on the shore, and each night he would return to the depths, unable or unwilling to remain permanently in the human world. The other Apkallu are described similarly, each with some element of divine or monstrous form combined with human characteristics, each emerging from the boundary realms between worlds to deliver specific knowledge that humanity could not have developed on its own. Some are depicted with wings and the features of birds. Others carry the symbols of the gods they served, the bucket and cone that represented purification and blessing in Mesopotamian iconography. In the carved reliefs that archaeologists have recovered from Assyrian palaces, the Apkallu stand beside kings and sacred trees, their hybrid forms unmistakable, their function as intermediaries between realms written in their very bodies. The Bit Meseri texts, which contain ritual instructions for protecting buildings and households from evil spirits, specify that figurines of the Apkallu should be buried at thresholds and foundations, that their hybrid nature gives them power over the boundaries between worlds that demons might exploit. They are protectors specifically because they belong fully to neither realm, because their mixed nature allows them to operate in the liminal spaces where danger lurks. But here is the question that most scholars politely avoid. The implication that hovers over all the Apkallu material, like smoke over a sacrifice. If these beings were hybrids, if they carried both divine and human nature in their bodies, how did they come to be? The texts do not describe the Apkallu as creations shaped from clay like ordinary humans. They do not describe them as gods who chose to appear in hybrid form. The consistent implication, never quite stated directly, but threading through all the material, is that the Apkallu were born, that they had parents, that somewhere in their ancestry, divine beings and human beings came together and produced offspring who inherited characteristics of both lineages. The Adapa myth makes this more explicit than most texts. Adapa is described as a human sage created by the god Ea, who is also known as Enki, the lord of wisdom and fresh waters. But the word used for this creation is unusual. Ea is said to have made Adapa perfect, to have given him divine wisdom and understanding, to have made him one of the Apkallu, though his origins were human. Some translations render this as Ea creating Adapa from nothing like any divine creation, but the Akkadian terminology suggests something more like modification, improvement, the elevation of an existing being to a higher state. Adapa is perfect in understanding, but not in nature. He possesses the wisdom of the gods, but not their immortality. When Anu, the king of heaven, summons Adapa to account for accidentally breaking the wings of the south wind, Ea warns him not to eat or drink anything offered in the heavenly realm. Adapa obeys and thereby rejects the bread and water of eternal life that Anu offers, remaining mortal despite his divine wisdom. The myth has been read many ways by many scholars, but one thread is constant. Adapa represents something between ordinary humanity and full divinity, a being who has been touched by the gods, improved by the gods, but not fully transformed into a god. He is an intermediate creation, a stepping stone, a prototype. And the Apkallu as a group represents 7 such beings, 7 intermediaries, 7 bridges between worlds who lived in the age before the flood, and who apparently did not survive that cataclysm, or did not reproduce afterward to continue their hybrid lineage into historical times. Where did the Apkallu go? The texts are largely silent on this question. They appear in the antediluvian age, they teach humanity the foundations of civilization, and then they vanish. After the flood, the texts speak of human sages called Umanu, who continue the traditions the Apkallu established, but these Umanu are explicitly described as mortal, as learned men rather than hybrid beings. Something changed at the flood. The lineage of divine and human mixing that produced the Apkallu did not continue afterward, at least not in the same form. The boundary between the realms seems to have hardened, the crossing that was once possible becoming impossible, or at least much more rare. This pattern, this sense of something ending at the flood, becomes even more striking when we turn to a tradition that developed separately from the Mesopotamian texts, but tells a remarkably similar story. In the book of Genesis, in a passage that has troubled commentators for millennia, we read that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. This occurs in chapter 6, just before the flood narrative, positioned in the text as part of the explanation for why God decided to destroy humanity with rising waters. The Hebrew phrase translated as sons of God is B'nai Elohim, a term that elsewhere in Hebrew scripture refers unambiguously to divine or angelic beings, members of the heavenly court who serve the Most High. The daughters of men are ordinary human women, the term Benot Adam emphasizing their mortal, earthly nature. The sons of God saw them, found them attractive, and took them as wives. The offspring of these unions are called Nephilim, a Hebrew term whose etymology scholars have debated for centuries without reaching consensus. The word might derive from a root meaning to fall, suggesting fallen ones, beings who descended from heaven to earth. It might relate to a root meaning to be wonderful or extraordinary, suggesting beings of unusual nature or ability. In the context of the Genesis narrative, the Nephilim are associated with the Gibborim, the mighty men of old, men of renown, heroes of a sort, but heroes whose very existence seems to represent something wrong, something transgressive, something that contributes to the corruption that provokes the flood. The Genesis account is frustratingly brief, a mere 4 verses before the text moves on to Noah and the ark. But the Book of Enoch, a Jewish text that did not make it into the canonical Hebrew Bible, but was tremendously influential in ancient Judaism and early Christianity, and it expands this story into an elaborate mythology of divine transgression and cosmic consequence. According to Enoch, 200 beings called Watchers, angelic figures whose appointed task was to observe humanity from heaven, made a collective decision to descend to earth and take human wives. They gathered on Mount Hermon, a peak at the boundary of ancient Israel, and they swore an oath binding them together in this transgression, knowing that what they planned was forbidden, that it would anger the Most High, that it would have consequences beyond anything they could fully anticipate. The Watchers descended. They took human women as wives. They fathered children who grew into giants, beings of immense size and appetite who consumed resources faster than humanity could produce them, who eventually turned to violence and cannibalism when normal food sources proved insufficient. The corruption spread through the earth until God determined that only a total cleansing could restore order, that only the flood could eliminate the hybrid offspring and their corrupted human mothers and restart the human experiment with Noah's family alone. But the Book of Enoch adds another element that echoes the Apkallu traditions with unsettling precision. The Watchers did not merely father hybrid children. They taught humanity forbidden knowledge. One Watcher named Azazel taught metalworking, the making of swords and shields and the machinery of war. He taught women the use of cosmetics and jewelry, the arts of adornment that the text presents as instruments of seduction. Another watcher named Semjaza taught enchantments and root cuttings, the origins of herbal magic and pharmacology. Others taught astrology, the reading of clouds, the signs of the sun and moon, knowledge that gave humanity power over nature that the text suggests we were never meant to possess. The parallel with the Apkallu traditions is remarkable. In both cases, hybrid beings emerge from the union of divine and human. In both cases, these beings or their divine parents teach humanity the arts of civilization, knowledge that elevates humans above their natural state, but also introduces dangers and complications that did not exist before. In both cases, this period of divine and human mixing ends with a catastrophic flood that destroys most of humanity and apparently terminates the practice of interbreeding. In both cases, the age after the flood is different from the age before, characterized by greater separation between divine and human realms, by the disappearance of hybrid beings, by a hardening of the boundary that was once crossed so freely. Now these traditions developed in different cultures, in different languages, with different theological frameworks and different purposes. Scholars who wish to maintain clear boundaries between traditions will emphasize the differences, will note that the Enochic literature dates to centuries after the Mesopotamian texts, will suggest borrowing or independent development rather than common memory. And these scholarly cautions deserve respect. We should not too quickly assume that similar stories must describe the same events, that mythological parallels necessarily indicate historical connections. But let us also not too quickly dismiss the possibility that these traditions preserve, in different cultural vocabularies, memories of something that actually happened, or at least something that ancient peoples across a wide region believed had happened. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Israelites, and the Jewish communities that produced the Enochic literature all occupied the same broad geographical region, the Fertile Crescent and its environs, the lands where agriculture first developed and civilization first emerged. If something occurred in that region in the deep past, something involving the intersection of what people understood as divine and human, something that ended in catastrophe and restriction, we would expect to find memories of it in multiple traditions, each filtered through local theology and literary conventions, but preserving a common core. The flood itself is such a memory. Geological and archaeological evidence confirms that the Mesopotamian region experienced severe flooding in the 4th and 3rd millennia before the Common Era, that these floods would have seemed world-ending to the populations who experienced them, that the widespread flood traditions of the ancient Near East almost certainly preserve memory of actual catastrophic events, even if the theological interpretations varied widely. If the flood memory is historical, might the memories of what preceded the flood also contain historical elements? Might the traditions of divine beings mating with humans, of hybrid offspring, of knowledge transmission and ultimate prohibition, point towards something real that occurred in the forgotten depths of human prehistory? Let your eyes close if they are not already closed. Let your body sink deeper into stillness. Feel your breath moving slowly in and out without any effort to control it. Imagine yourself standing at the base of a great ziggurat in the hour before dawn. The stars are still visible above, the same stars that the ancient astronomers mapped and named, the same patterns that the Watchers supposedly taught humanity to read for signs and portents. The temple rises above you in stepped terraces, ascending toward the heavens like a staircase the gods might use to descend to earth. Somewhere within those massive walls, scribes are waking, preparing to record the words that priests will speak, the visions that seers will interpret, the traditions that must be preserved against the erosion of forgetting. They do not know that their tablets will lie buried for thousands of years, that their carefully pressed signs will be deciphered by scholars speaking languages they cannot imagine, that their records will spark questions in minds separated from theirs by an abyss of time. They write because the knowledge matters, because the memory must be preserved, because someone in the future will need to know what happened in the age before the flood, when the boundary between heaven and earth was thin enough to cross, when divine beings walked among mortals and found them fair, when children were born who carried both fires in their blood. The first light is touching the eastern horizon now. The temple priests are beginning their morning rituals. Somewhere, a scribe dips his stylus in water to soften the clay for writing. And we are about to descend deeper into the texts that speak not just of the interbreeding, but of its ending, not just of the crossing, but of the prohibition that closed the door between worlds. The gods did not rule alone. This is one of the most striking features of Mesopotamian theology, one that separates it from later monotheistic traditions, where a single divine will shapes all of creation without debate or opposition. In the ancient Near East, in the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, where civilization first emerged from the mud and reeds, the cosmos was governed by a council, a divine assembly that met to deliberate, to argue, to vote on matters of cosmic significance. You picture them gathering in the celestial equivalent of the Sumerian assembly halls, those same buildings where human elders met to decide matters of war and irrigation and justice. Anu presiding from the highest seat, the Sky Father whose name literally means heaven, remote and authoritative, the source of all legitimate power, even though he rarely exercised it directly. Enlil beside him, or just below, the Lord of the Command, whose word once spoken became reality, whose breath was the wind that could bring life-giving rain or devastating storms, the executive power of the cosmos, the one who implemented what the council decided. Enki present as well, the Lord of the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, God of wisdom and craft and cunning, the one who always found another way, who solved problems through cleverness rather than force, who repeatedly intervened to save humanity when other gods wanted us destroyed. And Ninhursag, the Great Mother, Lady of the Mountain, goddess of fertility and birth, who had shaped the first humans from clay mixed with divine blood, whose hands knew the secret of creating life from base matter. These four and dozens of others, the Anunnaki, the great gods who determined fates, and the Igigi, the lesser gods who carried out their decrees. They met in assembly, they debated, they disagreed, and their disagreements shaped human history. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on clay tablets dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BCE, but containing traditions far older, gives us an extraordinary window into these divine deliberations. And the text opens not with human creation, but with divine labor disputes. The Igigi gods have been working the earth for 40 years, digging canals and maintaining irrigation systems, and they are exhausted. They revolt against the Anunnaki, burning their tools and besieging the house of Enlil. This is a labor strike in heaven, and the solution proposed by Enki is revolutionary. Let us create a being to bear our burden, he suggests. Let there be a primitive worker to take over our toil. This is why humanity exists according to these texts. We were created to work, to serve, to free the gods from physical labor. But the creation process itself, as we explored earlier, involved mixing divine essence with earthly matter. Divine blood was required. A god had to be sacrificed, his intelligence and spirit mixed with clay, and through this mingling of heavenly and earthly substance, humanity was born. From the very beginning, we carried something divine within us. We were not purely creatures of the earth, but hybrids, composites, beings whose very nature contained a trace of the gods themselves. But the Atrahasis tells us what happened next, and this is where the pattern becomes troubling, where the trajectory of divine-human relations starts its long decline. Humanity multiplied. We did exactly what we were designed to do. We worked, we reproduced, we spread across the land. And as our numbers grew, so did the noise we made. The land bellowed like a bull, the text says. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil, the lord of the command, could not sleep. Human activity, human population, human noise had become intolerable to the divine order. And so Enlil proposed solutions. First, plague. Let disease sweep through the human population and reduce our numbers. But Enki, always the advocate for humanity, secretly warned one man, Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise. He advised him to direct all worship and offerings to Namtar, the god of plague, to the exclusion of other gods. Flattered by this attention, Namtar was shamed into calling off the disease. Enlil tried again. Drought. Let the rain cease, and famine reduce the human population. Again, Enki intervened, advising Atrahasis to direct worship to Adad, the rain god, who relented and sent water. Each time Enlil attempted to cull humanity, Enki found a way to save us. Until finally, Enlil proposed the ultimate solution: a flood to wipe humanity from the earth entirely. You know how this story ends. Enki warned Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim, or Ziusudra, depending on which version of the tradition you consult. A boat was built. Animals and family were loaded aboard. The deluge came and scoured the earth clean. When the waters receded, when the survivors emerged, when the gods smelled the sweet smoke of sacrifice rising from the altar, they gathered like flies around the offering, starving for the worship they had almost permanently lost. There was a reckoning. Enlil was furious that anyone had survived, that his plan had been subverted. But Enki argued that complete destruction was excessive, that humanity served essential purposes, that the cosmos needed workers and worshippers. A compromise was reached. Humanity would continue, but with new limitations. The text explicitly states that population control measures would be implemented. Infant mortality would increase. Some women would be barren. Certain priestesses would be forbidden from bearing children. Death itself would be more present, more constant, a check on human expansion. But there is something else in these deliberation accounts, something that scholars have debated for over a century. The discussions in the Divine Council did not end with population control. There are fragments, broken tablets, partially reconstructed texts that suggest another topic was addressed: the question of divine-human mingling itself. Let your breathing slow for a moment. Feel the weight of your chest rising and falling. These ancient tablets, broken and incomplete, are like messages received with half the words missing, like overhearing a conversation through a wall where only fragments reach you clearly. And we will never know everything that was decided in those divine councils. Much was lost. Much was never written down in the first place, preserved only in oral tradition that eventually faded into silence. But what fragments remain suggests something profound was concluded, something about the nature of divine-human relations going forward. In the basement archives of the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, there are fragments catalogued but rarely discussed in popular literature. Pieces of tablets recovered from Nineveh and other Assyrian sites, containing what appear to be copies of much older Babylonian and Sumerian originals. Most are too broken to yield continuous narrative. A word here, a phrase there, like stars visible through gaps in clouds. But certain fragments have been partially reconstructed through painstaking comparison with parallel texts, through the slow, patient work of Assyriologists, matching broken edges and filling gaps with educated conjecture. One such reconstruction, published in a German academic journal in the 1970s and rarely cited since, contains phrases that align disturbingly well with our investigation. The text appears to be a divine pronouncement, a decree issued by the council. The readable portions include references to seed and offspring, to mixing and mingling, and, most strikingly, to cessation. The Akkadian word that appears, though partially reconstructed from context, suggests ending or no longer. One possible translation offered by the original scholars reads something like, "The seed of the gods shall no longer enter the daughters of men." And another reading suggests divine essence shall not mix with earthly vessel. The tablet is broken precisely where we would most want it to continue, where presumably the rationale for this prohibition was explained. Similar fragments exist in the Louvre, pieces acquired during French excavations at Susa and Lagash in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These have been studied even less thoroughly, catalogued but not fully published, awaiting some future scholar with the time and funding to piece together their broken testimony. And there were tablets in Baghdad, in the Iraq Museum, that contained related material. Some of these were looted during the chaos of 2003, their whereabouts now unknown. Others were damaged, their surfaces scarred by fire and neglect. The full textual evidence for what we are discussing may have existed intact as recently as 20 years ago, and may now be scattered across private collections or lost entirely. What we have are fragments, pieces of a puzzle that may never be complete, but the pieces that remain point in a consistent direction. Sometime after the flood, possibly as part of the same council deliberations that established mortality and population controls, a prohibition was issued. Divine beings would no longer produce offspring with humans. Why would such a prohibition be necessary? Why would the gods, who had created humanity in the first place by mixing their essence with clay, decide to stop this mingling? The texts themselves, fragmentary as they are, suggest several possibilities, and scholars have debated these for decades. Now, the first, and perhaps most intuitive explanation, involves dilution. If divine essence was being passed to hybrid offspring, and those offspring were producing children of their own, each generation would carry less of the divine spark than the generation before. The Sumerian king list, that remarkable document we examined earlier, shows this pattern clearly in its declining reign lengths. Antediluvian kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. The first kings after the flood ruled for hundreds of years. By the historical period, reign lengths had normalized to human lifespans. If these numbers encode something real about the diminishing of divine heritage, about the thinning of celestial bloodlines through successive generations, then the prohibition makes a certain terrible sense. The gods were watching their essence dilute, watching each generation of hybrids become less divine, more mortal, more ordinary. Perhaps they decided to stop the process while some potency remained, rather than watch it fade to nothing. A second possibility involves stability, or rather instability. Hybrid beings in mythology are often dangerous, unpredictable, difficult to control. The Nephilim of Hebrew tradition were giants who brought violence to the earth. The Greek heroes born of divine human unions were extraordinary warriors, but also sources of conflict and chaos. Achilles brought glory to the Greeks, but also a wrath that killed thousands of his own allies. Heracles completed his labors, but also murdered his own family in divinely induced madness. The hybrid condition seems to carry risk. Perhaps the gods observed that their offspring with humans were becoming increasingly unstable, that the mixture of divine and mortal natures produced beings who fit comfortably in neither world, who had the power to cause tremendous destruction, but not the divine wisdom to wield that power responsibly. The prohibition might have been a safety measure, a recognition that the experiment had produced too many dangerous variants. A third possibility is jealousy and conflict among the gods themselves. If certain gods were producing hybrid offspring and favoring those offspring over others, tensions would inevitably arise. Human rulers claiming divine parentage, demanding special treatment, creating cults around their supposed celestial heritage. Gods becoming attached to their mortal children and intervening in human affairs on their behalf, are disrupting the natural order, playing favorites in ways that other gods resented. The Greek myths are full of such conflicts. Hera's persecution of Heracles stemmed from jealousy of Zeus's mortal lovers. The Trojan War was partly caused by divine rivalries playing out through mortal proxies. Perhaps the Mesopotamian Council decided to ban interbreeding not for humanity's sake, but to preserve peace among themselves, to prevent divine conflicts from escalating through competing hybrid lineages. A fourth possibility is that humanity had somehow become unworthy. The texts consistently emphasize human corruption before the flood, our violence and noise and disorder. Perhaps the gods concluded that their essence was being wasted on an undeserving species, that humans had failed to live up to the divine heritage we carried, that we had proven ourselves unfit for the gods' continued intimate involvement. This reading has theological resonance with later traditions. The Hebrew scriptures describe God regretting the creation of humanity before the flood. The Greek gods retreated progressively from mortal affairs as human behavior worsened. The theme of divine disappointment runs through mythology worldwide. Perhaps the prohibition was punishment, a withdrawal of divine favor from a species that had squandered it. A fifth and more optimistic possibility is that the mission was complete. Perhaps the interbreeding had always been intended as temporary, a means of establishing certain bloodlines or implanting certain capabilities or achieving some specific goal that was accomplished by the time of the flood. The prohibition in this reading would not be punishment, but graduation. The gods had done what they came to do. Humanity had been modified, improved, given what we needed. Now we were expected to continue on our own. This interpretation aligns with traditions of the gods as teachers rather than rulers, as beings who came to instruct and elevate humanity before returning to their proper realm. The Apkallu sages taught the arts of civilization and then departed. Perhaps the divine parents who mingled their essence with ours were doing the same thing on a biological level, implanting what was needed, then stepping back to let us develop independently. And there is a sixth possibility, darker than the others and more frequently whispered than stated openly in academic literature. Perhaps the gods were preparing to leave entirely. Perhaps they knew or decided that their time of direct involvement with Earth was ending, that they would be withdrawing to whatever celestial realm they called home, and that maintaining intimate connections with humanity would make that departure more difficult. Severing ties before separation. A parent who knows they will have to abandon their children might choose to end the relationship gradually rather than all at once. If the gods were going away, the prohibition on interbreeding was a preparation, a first step toward complete withdrawal. Stop producing new children here. Let the existing hybrid lines thin and fade. When we finally depart, the connection will be weaker, the loss less devastating for both sides. Consider Gilgamesh through this lens. The great king of Uruk, a 2/3 divine and 1/3 human according to the epic that bears his name. He is described as the most beautiful, the most powerful, the most extraordinary being who ever walked the earth, and he knows he is going to die. His entire quest, the journey to find Utnapishtim and learn the secret of immortality, stems from this terrible awareness. He is almost a god. He carries more divine essence than perhaps any human ever had or ever would again. And yet, he is mortal. He watches his beloved friend Enkidu die and knows that he will follow. The epic can be read as the tragedy of the last hybrids, the final generation with significant divine heritage, watching that heritage drain away, knowing that their descendants will be less than they are, that the divine connection is fading with each generation. When Gilgamesh finally fails to achieve immortality, when he loses the plant of youth to a serpent and returns to Uruk empty-handed, he is accepting something vast and terrible. Not just his own death, but the death of divine human intimacy itself. The age of hybrids is ending. What comes after will be purely human, for better and for worse. Did the prohibition create the tragedy of the human condition? It is a question worth holding, not answering, but holding, turning over like a smooth stone in the mind. Before the prohibition, if these texts describe something real, humans carried active divine heritage. We lived longer. We perceived more. We had access to the gods, not just through prayer and sacrifice, but through blood and kinship. The gods were literally our relatives, our parents and grandparents and ancestors. After the prohibition, that connection began to fade. Each generation more mortal than the last, each generation more alone. Until finally we arrived at the present age, when divine contact comes only through vision and meditation and faith, never through the simple intimacy of family, never through the obvious, undeniable bond of shared blood. Let your body settle deeper now. Feel the support beneath you, the darkness around you. You are a descendant of those ancient people who watched the gods withdraw, who felt the divine heritage thinning in their veins, who passed down stories of a time when things were different. Whatever those stories encode, whether literal history or metaphorical truth or something in between, they are your inheritance. The prohibition, if it happened to your ancestors. The loss, if there was loss, is woven into your lineage. And the question that lingers, that will follow you into sleep, is simply this: what were we like before? What did we lose when the gods stopped coming to us, stopped mingling their essence with ours, stopped producing children who could walk in both worlds? And what did we become in their absence? We who are purely human now, we who carry only traces and echoes and fragments of what was once divine. Picture yourself standing at the gates of a great Mesopotamian city in the age after the prohibition. The walls rise before you, mud brick and bitumen, already ancient, already showing the wear of centuries. The ziggurat rises in the distance, stepped and massive, a mountain made by hands. The priests are climbing to its summit to make the morning offering, but they are only priests now, intermediaries, and not children of gods. The divine presence is distant. You can feel it in the air somehow, an absence, a silence where once there was conversation. Something has changed. Something is missing. And the people moving through the gates around you, traders and farmers and craftsmen and slaves, they do not remember how it was before. For them, this is normal. This is how it has always been. Only the old stories speak of another time, and the old stories are fading, becoming myth, becoming entertainment for children rather than history for adults. This is the world after the prohibition. This is the world we inherited. This is what we are. Now we must travel beyond Mesopotamia, beyond the clay tablets and ziggurat temples, into territories that should, by all conventional understanding, have no connection to what we have been exploring. And yet what we find there will trouble any simple explanation, will suggest either a pattern so fundamental to human psychology that every civilization independently invented the same story, or something far stranger. A shared memory of events so ancient that they predate the separation of human populations across the globe. Events that burned themselves so deeply into collective consciousness that no amount of time or distance could erase them entirely. Let us begin in Greece, in the world of Hesiod, that farmer poet who lived around 700 BCE in a small village in Boeotia, who one day, according to his own account, was tending sheep on the slopes of Mount Helicon when the Muses themselves appeared to him and breathed divine voice into his lungs, commanding him to sing of the gods and of the ages of man. What Hesiod recorded in his poem Works and Days was not his own invention, but something far older, a tradition passed down through generations of Greek singers and storytellers, a cosmological history that the Greeks believed described the literal progression of humanity from its origins to the present day. And what this history describes is nothing less than a systematic withdrawal of divine presence from the human world, a progressive separation that mirrors almost exactly what we have seen in the Mesopotamian tradition. Hesiod speaks of 5 ages, 5 distinct epochs of human existence, each one further removed from the divine than the one before, each one representing a diminishment, a falling away from an original state of closeness with the gods. The first age was the Golden Age, and when Hesiod describes this era, His language takes on a quality of nostalgic reverence that suggests he is speaking of something almost too beautiful to fully comprehend. In the Golden Age, he tells us, humans lived like gods themselves, free from toil and suffering, their minds untroubled by grief, their bodies untouched by the miseries of old age. The earth gave forth its fruits without labor, the seasons were perpetually mild, and when death came, it came like sleep, gently, without pain or fear. But what is most striking about Hesiod's description of the Golden Age is not the paradise he depicts, but the relationship he describes between humans and gods. In this first age, the immortals who dwell on Olympus made the golden race of mortal men, and these humans lived close to their creators, in a state of communion that later ages would lose entirely. The gods walked among them, ate with them, conversed with them, and, though Hesiod is not explicit about this, the implication hangs over his account like morning mist, the suggestion that in this first age, the boundary between divine and human was porous, permeable, that beings could pass from one category to the other, that the children of gods and the children of men were not yet fully distinct. Then came the Silver Age, and already the decline has begun. The humans of the Silver Age were inferior to their golden predecessors, foolish and impious, unable to restrain themselves from violence against one another, unwilling to honor the gods with proper sacrifice and worship. They lived for 100 years as children, Hesiod tells us, growing slowly, reaching maturity only to die shortly after, as if their extended childhood consumed all the vitality that should have sustained adult life. Zeus, looking down from Olympus, was displeased. The intimacy of the Golden Age was already fading, the gods beginning to withdraw to their mountain, watching from a distance rather than walking alongside. And when Zeus finally destroyed the silver race for their impiety, he did not mourn them, as he might have mourned the golden humans who had lived so close to the divine. The Bronze Age followed, and now Hesiod's language takes on a darker tone, describing a race of humans terrible and mighty, consumed by warfare, delighting in violence, their armor and weapons and even their houses made entirely of bronze because iron had not yet been discovered. These bronze humans destroyed themselves through their own aggression, descending to the cold house of Hades, leaving no names behind, anonymous in their brutality, unmourned by gods who had by now retreated still further, who no longer walked among mortals or shared their tables or took interest in individual human lives. But then comes the Fourth Age, and here Hesiod's scheme becomes most interesting for our purposes, because the Fourth Age is not simply another step in the decline, not simply another generation of inferior humans, but something different entirely, a partial restoration, a final flourishing of divine-human connection before the ultimate withdrawal. This is the heroic age, the age of the demigods, the era when gods and mortals produced children together in numbers that would never be seen again. Hesiod calls them the godlike race of hero men, and his catalogue of their deeds reads like a roll call of every great figure from Greek mythology. Heracles, son of Zeus, and the mortal woman Alcmene, strongest of all humans, who performed 12 impossible labors and was ultimately raised to Olympus itself to dwell among the gods. Perseus, also a son of Zeus, conceived when the king of the gods visited the princess Danae as a shower of golden light, who slew the Gorgon Medusa and rescued Andromeda from the sea monster. Achilles, son of the sea goddess Thetis and the mortal king Peleus, swiftest and most beautiful of all the warriors who fought at Troy, whose divine mother had tried to make him immortal by dipping him in the river Styx, whose one vulnerable heel became the site of his death. Theseus, claimed as a son by both Poseidon and the mortal king Aegeus, slayer of the Minotaur. Helen, daughter of Zeus and the mortal woman Leda, whose beauty launched the 1,000 ships. Everywhere you look in the heroic age, you find these hybrid beings, children of gods and mortals, walking the earth in numbers that suggest a final great flowering of divine-human interbreeding, before some fundamental change made such unions impossible or forbidden. And here is what should give us pause, what should make us lean closer to these ancient Greek texts with the same attention we have given to the Mesopotamian tablets. The Greeks themselves believed that the heroic age ended, that it came to a definitive close, that the demigods were a temporary phenomenon rather than an ongoing feature of human existence. The Trojan War, that 10-year catastrophe that killed so many heroes and brought so much suffering to Greeks and Trojans alike, and was understood in ancient tradition as a deliberate divine action, a culling, a means of reducing the demigod population that had grown too numerous, too powerful, too disruptive to the cosmic order. The Cypria, an early Greek epic now lost except for summaries and fragments, stated this explicitly. Zeus saw that the earth was being oppressed by the multitude of human beings, and since there was no piety among them, he decided to lighten the burden on the earth by kindling the great war at Troy, so that through death he might diminish the population. And particularly, we might add, the hybrid population, the demigods whose divine heritage made them both more powerful and more problematic than ordinary mortals. The gods who had fathered and mothered these children at Troy watched their offspring die, sometimes killing each other, sometimes falling to purely mortal enemies, and they wept. But they did not intervene to save them, as if some agreement, some prohibition, some new order had been established that required even divine parents to let their hybrid children perish. After Troy, after the heroes who survived the war wandered home through years of trial and suffering, after Odysseus finally reached Ithaca and Agamemnon was murdered by his wife, and Achilles lay buried beneath a mound on the Trojan plain, the heroic age ended. It ended not gradually, but definitively, as if a door had closed, as if a decree had been issued. The Iron Age began, Hesiod's own era, our era, an age of toil and suffering and distance from the divine. In the Iron Age, humans must work for their bread, must watch their children grow old and die, must endure injustice and violence with no expectation of divine intervention. The gods no longer walk among us. They no longer father children on mortal women or bear children to mortal men. They have withdrawn to Olympus, have become observers rather than participants, have ended whatever program of interbreeding had produced the great heroes of the Fourth Age. Hesiod knows this, laments it, tells his readers that he wishes he had died before or been born after this present age of iron, because to live in the time of maximum separation from the divine is to live in diminishment, in loss, in awareness of what has been taken away. And now, let your breath deepen. Let your body settle more heavily into whatever surface supports you, because we are going to travel much further across mountains and oceans and millennia, to a tradition that should have no connection whatsoever to Greece or Mesopotamia, a tradition that developed in complete isolation from Mediterranean civilization, and yet tells almost exactly the same story. The Hindu concept of the yugas, the great ages through which the cosmos cycles, presents a pattern so similar to Hesiod's 5 ages that scholars have long debated whether there was some ancient contact, some shared origin, some transmission of ideas across the vast distances separating Greece from India. The standard academic position is that the similarities are coincidental, that both traditions independently developed cyclical time concepts because such concepts appeal to basic human psychology. But when you examine the details, when you trace the specific claims about divine-human relations across the ages, the coincidences begin to strain credibility. According to Hindu cosmology, time moves through 4 great ages in a descending pattern of increasing darkness and decreasing divine presence. Satya Yuga, the age of truth, comes first, lasting 1,728,000 years by some calculations. In this golden age, Dharma, the cosmic law that maintains order and righteousness, stands on all 4 legs like a sturdy table, complete and unwavering. Humans live for hundreds of thousands of years. Disease is unknown. The gods move freely between heaven and earth, interacting with humans, teaching them, sometimes living among them in physical form. In the oldest Hindu texts, the Vedas and the early Upanishads, we find accounts of rishis, seers and sages who were often described as children of gods, or hybrid beings whose divine parentage gave them special wisdom and power. The 7 great rishis, the Saptarishi, were said to be mind-born sons of Brahma himself, created directly by the Creator God to assist in populating the world with wise and righteous beings. Their descendants intermarried with humans, their divine heritage diluting with each generation but never entirely disappearing, so that even today certain Brahmin lineages claim descent from these original divine human hybrids. Then comes Treta Yuga, the second age, lasting 1,296,000 years. Dharma now stands on 3 legs, diminished by 1/4. Human lifespans shorten to tens of thousands of years, then to thousands. Virtue decreases, conflict increases. The gods still intervene in human affairs, but less directly, less frequently. The great epics of the Ramayana and Mahabharata are set in Treta and Dvapara Yugas, respectively, and both epics are populated with divine human children, with avatars and demigods, with beings whose hybrid nature marks them as belonging to an age when such mixing was still possible. Rama, hero of the Ramayana, was an avatar of Vishnu, the god incarnated in human form through divine birth to a mortal mother. The 5 Pandava brothers, heroes of the Mahabharata, were each fathered by a different god on the Queen Kunti and her co-wife Madri through a mystical process that allowed the women to invoke any deity and receive a child. Arjuna, the greatest warrior among the Pandavas, was son of Indra, king of the gods. Yudhishthira was son of Dharma himself, the god of righteousness. Bhima was son of Vayu, the wind god. These were not metaphors, are not honorary titles, but literal statements of parentage that the ancient Indians understood as historical fact. Dvapara Yuga follows, lasting 864,000 years, Dharma standing on only 2 legs, half of cosmic order already lost. Here, lifespans drop to mere centuries, then to decades. Gods still manifest on Earth, but increasingly through avatars, through incarnations, rather than through physical presence and interbreeding. The distinction is crucial. An avatar is a god taking temporary form descending into matter and then withdrawing. It is not the same as a god mating with a human and producing hybrid offspring. The shift from one mode of divine-human contact to the other marks a fundamental change in the relationship between realms. And then comes Kali Yuga, the Dark Age, our present age according to Hindu calculation, which began in 3102 BCE and will last for 432,000 years. In Kali Yuga, Dharma stands on one leg only, barely maintaining balance, ready to fall entirely. Human lifespans are short, disease is rampant, virtue is rare, and the gods have withdrawn almost entirely from direct involvement in human affairs. They no longer walk among us. They no longer father children on mortal women. They no longer intervene in obvious ways to reward the righteous or punish the wicked. Prayer and meditation and spiritual practice can still reach them, can still establish connection, but it is connection across a vast distance, like calling out to someone on a distant mountain and waiting, hoping to hear an answer. The texts are explicit about this withdrawal. The Bhagavata Purana describes how at the end of Dvapara Yuga, when Lord Krishna departed from the earth after being shot by a hunter's arrow that struck his one vulnerable heel, a detail that echoes Achilles so precisely it seems impossible that both traditions are not drawing on some common source. Kali Yuga began immediately. Krishna's departure marked the final closing of the door between divine and human realms. He was the last avatar to walk physically among humans for any extended period. He was the last divine being to father children with mortal women. After him, nothing but the long dark age of separation. And here is what makes the Hindu tradition particularly interesting for our investigation. Unlike the Greek tradition, which simply describes the withdrawal and leaves its reasons somewhat vague, the Hindu texts offer explanations for why the gods retreated. The interbreeding had caused problems. The hybrid children, possessed of superhuman powers, but also of human weaknesses like jealousy and pride and lust for power, had created chaos. The Mahabharata itself, that vast epic of over 100,000 verses, is essentially the story of a family war caused by hybrid beings whose divine heritage made them too powerful to coexist peacefully. The great war at Kurukshetra, which forms the climax of the epic, killed millions, devastated kingdoms, and reduced the noble warrior class to a remnant. Sound familiar? A great war that killed the demigods, that cleared the earth of hybrid beings, that marked the transition from an age of divine-human mixing to an age of separation. The pattern is identical to what we saw in the Greek tradition. The names are different, the cultural details vary, but the structure is the same. Gods interbreed with humans. Hybrid children proliferate. Problems emerge. A catastrophic war kills most of the hybrids. The gods withdraw. A darker age begins. And across the world, separated by the Himalayas and the vast distances of the Asian continent, yet another civilization was telling the same story. Ancient China developed its own tradition of divine withdrawal, its own account of an early age when gods and humans lived together, intermarried, produced hybrid children, and then gradually separated. The three august ones, those legendary rulers who governed China before recorded history, were not fully human. Fu Xi, first of the three august ones, was depicted with the body of a serpent and the head of a man, a hybrid being who taught humanity the basics of civilization, the art of cooking, of fishing with nets, of domesticating animals, of writing through the 8 trigrams that would later become the I Ching. His sister and wife, Nu Wa, also serpent-bodied, created humanity itself according to some traditions, forming the first humans from yellow earth, breathing life into them, establishing marriage customs and social harmony. After the 3 august ones came the 5 emperors, still divine or semi-divine, still possessing powers and lifespans beyond human norm, but already showing the beginning of separation, already more distant from the celestial realms than their predecessors. Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, greatest of the 5, was said to be the son of a woman who conceived him after seeing a great lightning bolt illuminate the sky. A divine impregnation similar to Danae, conceiving Perseus from Zeus's golden light. Huangdi ruled for 100 years, invented medicine, the calendar, the chariot, the boat, and countless other foundations of civilization. And at the end of his reign, he did not die, but ascended bodily to heaven on a dragon, leaving the mortal realm entirely. The dragon's symbolism throughout Chinese mythology deserves attention here. Dragons in Chinese tradition are not monsters to be slain, but divine beings, sky powers, lords of rain and rivers and cosmic order. The early emperors were called the Dragon Kings, and they were depicted with dragon features, dragon scales, dragon powers, because they were understood to be of dragon descent, hybrid offspring of celestial dragons and human women. As the centuries passed and the legendary emperors gave way to the historical dynasties, the dragon imagery remained, but its meaning shifted. And the emperor was no longer a dragon hybrid, but a human who served as the dragon's representative, who held the mandate of heaven, not by blood, but by virtue and divine approval. The direct connection had been severed. The age of interbreeding had ended. What remained was symbol, memory, the residue of a relationship that no longer functioned as it once had. The concept of Di, that untranslatable Chinese term usually rendered as virtue or power or moral force, may preserve a trace of this ancient understanding. The early emperors possessed Di in vast quantities, and their Di was understood not as moral achievement, but as inherited substance, as something passed down from divine ancestors, diluting with each generation until ordinary humans possessed only fragments and traces. The entire project of Confucian self-cultivation and of Taoist spiritual practice, of Buddhist meditation as it developed in China, can be understood as an attempt to recover or regenerate this lost divine substance through discipline and practice, to achieve through effort what the ancient hybrid rulers possessed by birth. The Taoist tradition preserves this understanding most explicitly. The Xian, the immortals of Taoist legend, are humans who through spiritual cultivation have achieved divine status, have recovered the celestial nature that was lost when the gods withdrew. They live on sacred mountains, they ride dragons through the sky, they possess powers that the ancient hybrid rulers possessed naturally. But they had to work for it, had to struggle for it, had to transform themselves through decades or centuries of practice. The path is open, but it is hard. Far harder than simply being born with divine blood. And if you have drifted, if sleep has begun to claim you, that is entirely right. Let these patterns wash over you like waves, depositing their sediment in places you may not consciously access, but that will shape your thoughts nonetheless. We are approaching the last great tradition we will examine tonight, and it is perhaps the strangest, the most distant, the most challenging to any theory of cultural transmission, because we must cross the Atlantic Ocean now, must enter the Americas, must visit civilizations that developed in complete isolation from the old world, and yet, somehow, impossibly, tell the same story. The Aztecs, heirs to thousands of years of Mesoamerican civilization, had their own account of cosmic ages, their own narrative of divine withdrawal. They called them the 5 suns, 5 distinct world ages, each one ending in catastrophe, each one requiring the gods to create humanity anew. The current age, the 5th sun, began when the god Nanahuatzin sacrificed himself by leaping into a great fire, becoming the sun that now lights our sky. But before he could move across the heavens, before he could rise and set as a proper sun should, he demanded a price. The other gods had to sacrifice themselves too, had to give their blood and their lives to set the cosmos in motion. This they did, and the 5th sun began. But it began as an age of separation, an age when the gods who had walked among humans in previous epochs had immolated themselves, had withdrawn from physical presence even as their essence powered the cosmos. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a most beloved of Mesoamerican gods, departed physically from the world at the end of a previous age. The stories vary in their details, but the structure is consistent. Quetzalcoatl ruled in the city of Tula as a god king, a divine being in human form, teaching arts and wisdom and peaceful practices. Then, through trickery or sin or the machinations of rival gods, he was forced to leave. He sailed away on a raft of serpents toward the east, toward the rising sun, promising to return someday to reclaim his kingdom. The Aztec emperor Moctezuma, facing the arrival of Cortés and his conquistadors from the east in 1519, genuinely believed, or at least seriously considered, that this might be Quetzalcoatl returning as promised. The expectation of divine return was not a metaphor or a pleasant story, but a living belief, as a political and religious reality that shaped how an empire responded to invasion. And the feathered serpent himself, what was he? A god, yes, but a god of mixed nature, feathered like a bird of heaven, serpentine like a creature of earth, combining celestial and terrestrial in one being. The symbolism suggests hybridity, suggests a being who bridges worlds, and the Mesoamerican traditions are full of such figures. The Maya hero twins, Hunahpu and Ixbalanque, descended to the underworld, outwitted the death gods, died and were reborn, ascended to become the sun and moon. They were divine, but born of a mortal woman whose husband was a god. They were hybrid beings who moved between realms, who navigated the dangerous boundaries between life and death, divine and human, heaven and earth. And then they departed, ascending to the sky, leaving humanity to continue without their physical presence. The pattern repeats across Mesoamerican civilization. Divine beings involve themselves in human affairs, sometimes producing hybrid offspring, sometimes teaching knowledge, sometimes ruling as god kings. Then they leave. They ascend to the sky or sail across the sea or sacrifice themselves to power the cosmos. And the world continues without them, waiting for the return that is always promised, always expected, that forms the horizon of religious hope. Let us pause here. Let us breathe. Let us allow these patterns to settle. What have we found? 4 great civilizations: Greek, Hindu, Chinese, Mesoamerican, separated by vast distances, developing in relative or complete isolation from each other, all telling versions of the same story. In the beginning, or in an earlier age, and gods and humans lived close together, They interacted freely. They produced children together. Hybrid beings walked the earth, possessing powers beyond normal humanity. Then something changed. A catastrophe occurred. A war, a flood, a divine decision. The hybrids were culled or simply stopped appearing. The gods withdrew to heaven, to Olympus, to the celestial realms, promising sometimes to return but no longer present in physical form. And humanity was left alone in an age of separation, an age of diminishment, an age of longing for something lost. The mainstream academic explanation for these parallels is convergent evolution of myth. Humans everywhere experience the same existential conditions, the same awareness of mortality, the same sense that something is missing, that the world should be more enchanted than it is. That we all project golden ages into the past because the present disappoints us. We all imagine that our ancestors lived closer to the divine because we feel distant from transcendence. We all tell stories of gods withdrawing because we need to explain why heaven feels so far away. This explanation has merit. Human psychology does contain universal patterns. The grief of mortality does generate predictable mythological responses. But the convergent evolution theory, satisfying as it is, does not quite account for the specificity of the parallels. We are not talking about vague similarities, not just comparing golden ages to golden ages, withdrawal to withdrawal. We are talking about specific structural elements appearing in the same sequence across unconnected traditions. Divine human interbreeding producing hybrid offspring. Problems emerging from this interbreeding. A catastrophic event, usually a war that kills most of the hybrids. Divine withdrawal following the catastrophe. A promise of eventual return. An age of separation continuing until the promised return occurs. This is not a simple pattern. This is a complex narrative structure with multiple elements arranged in a specific order. For 4 unconnected civilizations to independently invent this exact structure seems, at minimum, remarkable. At maximum, it suggests something else. It suggests that these traditions are not independent inventions, but preserved memories, fragments of a common experience so ancient that it predates the separation of human populations, so traumatic or transformative that it burned itself into cultural memory and survived tens of thousands of years of oral transmission, changing in surface details but retaining its essential structure. We cannot prove this. The evidence does not allow definitive conclusions. But we can note the pattern, can sit with the strangeness of it, can allow the question to remain open as we drift towards sleep. The question of why the gods stopped breeding with humans. The question of what changed, what was decided, what prohibition was enacted. The question is larger than any single tradition. It spans the globe. It links Mesopotamia to Greece, to India, to China, to Mexico. It whispers the same story in 100 different languages. And the story says, once we were not alone. Once the divine was near. Once the boundary between heaven and earth was permeable, and beings crossed it freely, and children were born who belonged to both realms. And then it ended. The door closed. The withdrawal began. And we have been waiting ever since, telling the story, keeping the memory alive, wondering if the promise of return will ever be fulfilled. Let these thoughts drift now. Let the patterns settle like sediment in deep water. You do not need to solve this mystery tonight. No one has solved it in all the millennia since the first storyteller sat by a fire and spoke of the gods who used to walk among us. The mystery is perhaps not meant to be solved, but to be inhabited, to be carried, to be passed down like the traditions themselves, changing in the telling, but preserving something essential, something that matters, something that might someday be understood by those who come after us, who inherit our questions along with our fragmentary answers. Now we enter stranger territory, the place where ancient mythology and modern biology begin to cast shadows that look unsettlingly similar, where patterns encoded in cuneiform tablets seem to echo patterns we can measure in laboratories, where the question of what divine human interbreeding might have meant transforms from theological abstraction into something we can almost touch with scientific instruments. I want to be clear about what we are doing here and what we are not doing. We are not arguing that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings who genetically engineered humanity in some literal laboratory sense. That interpretation, while popular in certain circles, makes claims far beyond what the evidence can support. What we are doing is something more subtle and perhaps more interesting. We are asking what the ancient mythmakers might have been observing, like what patterns in the world around them they were encoding in their stories of divine human unions, and whether those observations, filtered through their pre-scientific vocabulary, might correlate with things we now understand differently. Consider what happens biologically when different but related species interbreed. This is not speculation, but documented science, observable in nature and in our breeding programs. When a horse mates with a donkey, the offspring is a mule. Mules are remarkable creatures, stronger than either parent, more enduring, more resilient. This is what geneticists call hybrid vigor or heterosis, the phenomenon whereby first-generation hybrids often display enhanced qualities compared to either parent line. The combination of different genetic material creates something that, in certain measurable ways, exceeds its origins. But here is the crucial detail that makes the mythological parallels so striking. Mules are almost invariably sterile. The hybrid vigor that makes them so powerful also makes them genetic dead ends. The very thing that enhances them prevents them from passing those enhancements forward. And when hybrids can reproduce, something else happens in subsequent generations. The technical term is hybrid breakdown or outbreeding depression. The second generation, the third generation, these offspring often display decreased fitness, increased health problems, reduced fertility. The genetic compatibility issues that were masked in the first cross become amplified as the mixed genetic material tries and fails to sort itself cleanly. Consider ligers, the offspring of male lions and female tigers. First-generation ligers are enormous, often growing larger than either parent species, displaying a kind of biological excess that seems almost supernatural. But they suffer from health problems, shortened lifespans, and when they can reproduce at all, their offspring show even more severe issues. The pattern is clear. The more genetically distant the parent species, the more dramatic both the initial hybrid effects and the subsequent breakdown. Now hold that pattern in your mind and return to the Sumerian king list, that strange document we explored earlier with its impossible reign lengths. Before the flood, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. Immediately after, the reign lengths dropped dramatically, but were still impossibly long. As generations passed, the numbers continued to decrease, falling from thousands to hundreds, eventually reaching spans we recognize as human. Mainstream scholarship interprets these numbers as symbolic, mythological, not meant to be taken literally. Fair enough. But what were they symbolizing? What pattern were the ancient scribes encoding when they showed this specific trajectory of decline? If we read the King List not as literal biography, but as a kind of genetic record, a documentation of lineages and their characteristics, the pattern mirrors exactly what we would expect from hybrid breakdown. The first generation after divine human union, extraordinary, almost unlimited, displaying hybrid vigor of cosmic proportions. Subsequent generations, progressive decline as the mixed heritage becomes unstable, as the divine genetic material fails to maintain its integrity when diluted with purely human contributions. The Mesopotamian texts are explicit that something was being transmitted through these unions, something that could be measured in lifespan, in capability, in what they called melamu, or divine radiance. And they are equally explicit that this something diminished over time, that each generation received less of it, that by historical times, humans had become merely human, carrying perhaps traces of that heritage, but no longer manifesting its power. This is not proof of anything. It is pattern recognition, the observation that ancient mythmakers working without knowledge of genetics or evolutionary biology somehow encoded in their stories the exact trajectory that hybrid lines follow when documented scientifically. Either this is coincidence, or they were observing something real and describing it in the only vocabulary available to them, the vocabulary of gods and divine essence and heavenly descent. But let us push deeper into the genetic record itself, into what modern science has actually discovered about human ancestry, because here too we find patterns that complicate our comfortable assumptions about unbroken evolutionary development. In 1987, researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, published a study that changed our understanding of human origins. By analyzing mitochondrial DNA, that genetic material passed exclusively through maternal lines. They demonstrated that all living humans share a common female ancestor who lived approximately 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. The press called her Mitochondrial Eve, and while the name is somewhat misleading, the finding was revolutionary. All the tremendous diversity of human populations, every ethnicity, every variation, every living person on Earth, we all trace back through our mothers and their mothers and their mothers to a single population of women in Africa. The Y chromosome evidence tells a similar story for paternal lineage, pointing to a common male ancestor who lived perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. These dates do not align perfectly, which itself is significant, but both point to relatively recent convergence points in human ancestry, moments when the vast branching tree of humanity narrows to a single trunk. What this means, and what is often overlooked in popular accounts, is that there were other human populations, other lineages, other genetic experiments, if you want to use that language, that did not survive. The diversity that existed before these bottleneck events was lost. Whatever variations were present in those earlier populations, whatever capabilities they may have possessed, whatever traits we cannot even imagine because we have no record of them, these were eliminated when the human population crashed and then rebuilt from a relatively small founding group. Consider the Toba supervolcanic eruption approximately 74,000 years ago. The Toba catastrophe theory, while still debated among geneticists, suggests that this massive eruption triggered a volcanic winter lasting years, perhaps decades, causing a catastrophic reduction in human population. Some estimates suggest humanity was reduced to as few as 10,000 individuals globally, possibly fewer, a genetic bottleneck so severe that it should have left clear signatures in our DNA. And there are signatures, though their interpretation remains contested. What is less contested is the general principle. Catastrophic population crashes eliminate genetic diversity. When a population of millions is reduced to thousands, the rare variations, the unusual capabilities, the traits present in only small percentages of the population, these are disproportionately lost. The survivors carry forward only what they happen to carry, and their traits become the traits of all future generations through what geneticists call the founder effect. Now consider what this means for traits that might have been rare but extraordinary. If there were humans before these bottlenecks who possessed unusual longevity, enhanced perception, capabilities that seemed almost divine to their contemporaries, these traits would have had to be present in the surviving population to be carried forward. If they were rare, present in only a small percentage of the pre-catastrophe population, they might have been lost entirely, eliminated not through any deliberate prohibition, but through the blind mathematics of survival. The mythological record speaks of a time when humans lived for centuries, when some individuals possessed capabilities that set them apart from ordinary mortals, when the boundaries between human and divine were more permeable. Then came catastrophe, flood in most traditions, and afterward humans were diminished, mortal in the way we now understand mortality, cut off from whatever made the ancients more than merely human. What if the mythological account and the genetic account are describing the same events through different vocabularies? What if divine-human interbreeding is how ancient peoples described genetic variation that was subsequently lost? What if the gods stopping their visits is how they described the elimination of certain lineages through catastrophic population reduction? This is speculation. I want to emphasize this clearly. We cannot prove that ancient humans possessed extraordinary capabilities now lost. We cannot demonstrate scientifically that the mythological claims about divine heritage reflect genetic realities. But we can observe that the patterns match, that the mythological trajectory of decline from divine to human parallels what we would expect from hybrid breakdown and genetic bottlenecks. That the stories ancient peoples told about their origins, however symbolic their language, seem to encode observations about population dynamics and inheritance that we only developed the scientific framework to understand in the last century. But perhaps genetics is too narrow a lens. Perhaps what the ancients meant by divine essence, by the heritage of the gods, by the thing that was transmitted through sacred unions and subsequently lost, was not genetic at all in the biological sense, but something to do with consciousness itself, with how human beings experience awareness and selfhood and their relationship to the cosmos. In 1976, the Princeton psychologist Julian Jaynes published a book with a startling thesis. The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind proposed that human consciousness as we experience it, now with its unified sense of self, its internal dialogue, its capacity for introspection, is relatively recent in human history. Before approximately 3,000 years ago, Jaynes argued, humans experienced themselves differently. Their minds were bicameral, divided into two chambers, one that spoke and one that obeyed. what we would call volition, decision-making, planning for the future. These were experienced not as internal processes, but as external commands, as voices that seemed to come from outside the self, voices that ancient peoples identified as gods. James built his argument partly on close reading of ancient texts, particularly the Iliad, which he noted contains no words for concepts we take for granted: consciousness, mind, thinking, believing. The characters in Homer do not decide to act. They are instructed to act by gods who appear to them, speak to them, guide their hands in battle. When Achilles restrains his anger at Agamemnon, it is not through internal deliberation, but because Athena physically grabs his hair and tells him to stop. James proposed that Homer was not using poetic convention, but describing how consciousness actually functioned for people in that era. The gods were not metaphors for internal psychological processes. They were how humans experienced those processes before the development of what he called analog self and introspection. The bicameral mind broke down, James argued, sometime in the centuries before classical Greece, possibly triggered by the social disruptions of the Bronze Age collapse. As societies became more complex and less stable, and as the old hierarchies that channeled divine commands broke down, humans were forced to develop a new mode of consciousness, one in which the voice of the gods became the voice of the self, in which external command became internal deliberation. This transition, James believed, was traumatic and incomplete. The persistence of religious experience, of prophecy and possession and prayer, represents the lingering traces of bicameral mentality, moments when the old channels briefly reopen and humans once again hear what they interpret as divine voices. James's thesis remains controversial. Many psychologists and historians reject it as unstestable or as misreading the evidence. But aspects of his argument have gained support from unexpected quarters. Neuroscientists studying auditory hallucinations have found that the brain regions involved, particularly in the right temporal lobe, may indeed have functioned differently in earlier stages of human cognitive development. Research on the default mode network and hemispheric integration suggests that the unified sense of self we take for granted may be more fragile and historically contingent than we assume. Whether or not James was correct in his specific claims, his broader insight deserves attention. Human consciousness may not be a fixed, timeless attribute, but something that developed, that changed, that has a history. If this is true, then the mythological accounts of divine communication, of gods speaking directly to humans, of divine essence transmitted through union, might be describing not genetic transfer, but states of consciousness, modes of awareness that once were common and are now rare or lost entirely. What if the divine essence the Anunnaki transmitted was not located in chromosomes, but in neural architecture, in patterns of brain organization that enabled direct perception of aspects of reality now closed to us? What if the withdrawal of the gods describes not beings departing to other planets, but a shift in human consciousness that closed the channels through which divine perception flowed? What if we are all, in a sense, deaf and blind compared to our ancestors, operating with diminished bandwidth, receiving only a narrow slice of the signals that once flooded human awareness? This interpretation does not require belief in literal gods or extraterrestrial visitors. It requires only the acknowledgement that consciousness might have changed over historical time, that what ancient peoples called divine contact might have been a different configuration of awareness, and that this configuration, for whatever reason, became increasingly rare and eventually was lost to most of humanity. The prohibition on divine human breeding in this reading might describe the closing of a perceptual gateway rather than the cessation of physical reproduction. The texts speak of gods choosing to withdraw, choosing to stop transmitting their essence to human offspring. Perhaps this was not a choice made by external beings, but a description of an internal shift, the moment when human consciousness reorganized itself in ways that made divine perception, bicameral experience, the direct apprehension of cosmic forces, increasingly difficult to maintain and transmit. The children born after this shift would be different, would lack the capacity their parents possessed, would live in a world that seemed smaller, dimmer, more isolated, even if they could not articulate what had changed. And their children would know even less, would have only stories of ancestors who walked with gods, who heard divine voices, who lived lives of cosmic significance that their descendants could barely imagine. Within a few generations, these stories would become mythology, would be interpreted symbolically, because the literal interpretation would be impossible for minds configured in the new way. Minds like ours, minds that experience consciousness as unified, internal, and utterly cut off from anything that might be called divine. We cannot know which interpretation is correct, whether the mythological heritage involves genetics, consciousness, both, or something else entirely that we lack the concepts to describe. What we can observe is that something changed, that the ancient world describes a transition, and that every culture that has left us records seems to know about this transition and to mark it as the defining feature of human history, the moment when everything shifted, when what we are now began and what we were before ended. Perhaps the truth involves elements we have not even considered, mechanisms of transmission that operate through neither genes nor neurons, but through dimensions of existence our science has not yet learned to measure. The ancients may have been encoding not complete knowledge, but hints, fragments, the shadows cast by realities they perceived but could not fully articulate, leaving it to future generations to develop the tools and concepts necessary to decode what they could only describe in poetry and myth. Let your breathing slow now. Let the thoughts we have been building settle like sediment in still water. You are lying somewhere safe, somewhere quiet, and the night has grown deep around you. Above you, whether you can see them or not, the same stars wheel that have wheeled for billions of years. The same patterns our ancestors traced and named and wove into their stories of divine descent and cosmic order. You carry something from them, something transmitted through the unbroken chain of parents and children stretching back to the first humans who looked up at those stars and wondered. Whether that something is genetic or neurological or spiritual or all of these or none of these, it flows in you now, animates your awareness, makes possible the very thoughts you are thinking. The question of what the gods transmitted and why they stopped transmitting it is not merely ancient history. It is a question about what you are, about the nature of the awareness that is experiencing these words, about whether consciousness as you know it is the only possible configuration, or whether your ancestors knew modes of being now closed to you, perceptions now extinct, connections to the cosmos now severed. What did we inherit? What was taken away? These questions do not require answers tonight. They require only acknowledgement, the willingness to sit with uncertainty, to let the mystery remain mysterious while still taking it seriously. It's still turning it over in the dark, still feeling its weight and texture and strange familiarity. Feel your body sinking deeper into rest. Feel the boundary between waking and sleeping growing thin. Whatever flows in your veins, whatever patterns fire in your neurons, whatever essence or soul or consciousness animates your experience, it is carrying you now toward the threshold of dreams, toward that other country where different rules apply, where perhaps some of the ancients believed the old connections could still be accessed, the old voices could still be heard. If the gods stopped coming to us in waking life, they perhaps still visit in dreams. If the heritage was lost to our conscious minds, perhaps it lingers in the unconscious, in the parts of us that remember without knowing they remember, that carry without knowing they carry. As you drift, as the darkness grows softer and more welcoming, hold gently the question that matters most. If the gods stopped coming to us, what happened to those who remained? What did purely human humanity become in the absence of divine contact? What did we make of ourselves when we were finally fully alone? Now we come to the aftermath, to the world that remained after the divine chambers fell silent, after the last sacred marriages produced their final children, after the prohibitions settled over humanity like a veil drawn between worlds. And here we meet the most tragic figures in all of ancient literature, beings who embody the transition itself, who carry in their blood and bones the memory of what was and the reality of what would never be again. Gilgamesh of Uruk, king of the great walled city, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human according to the ancient tablets, the last of the great hybrids, or nearly the last, standing at the threshold between ages. When you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, that oldest of all heroic narratives preserved on 12 tablets in the library of Ashurbanipal and in fragments scattered across museum collections worldwide, you are reading the autobiography of a transitional being, someone who knows exactly what he is and knows equally well what that means. He is stronger than any mortal, wiser in some ways, capable of feats that ordinary humans cannot match, and yet he will die. He will die like any shepherd or potter or slave. The divine blood flowing through his veins, that inheritance from the goddess Ninsun, and whatever divine ancestry preceded her, grants him extraordinary capabilities, but not the one thing he desperately wants, the one thing that would make his hybrid nature complete rather than tragically partial. He wants immortality. He wants what the gods have. He wants what his divine heritage should have given him, but somehow did not. And his entire epic is the story of that wanting and its ultimate frustration. Consider what this means in the context of everything we have discussed tonight. If the prohibition had recently taken effect, if Gilgamesh represented one of the last generations to carry significant divine essence, then his quest takes on a different coloring entirely. He is not simply a human king afraid of death, as all humans are afraid. He is something more and something less. A being who can feel the divine fire within him, but cannot make it burn brightly enough to ward off the darkness. He has tasted what it means to be partly God, and found that taste maddening, because it is only partial, only a trace, only enough to make mortality feel like an injustice rather than simply a fact. When his beloved companion Enkidu dies, that wild man of the steppe, who had been created by the gods as a match for Gilgamesh, and who represented perhaps another form of divine creation, though different in kind, something breaks within the king of Uruk. He tears his hair, roams the wilderness, refuses to let the body be buried until a maggot falls from its nose and he can no longer deny the reality of death. And then he embarks on his famous journey, crossing the waters of death, seeking out Utnapishtim, the one mortal who achieved what Gilgamesh cannot achieve. Utnapishtim, who is called Ziusudra in earlier Sumerian accounts, and who corresponds to Noah in the Hebrew tradition, was granted immortality by the gods after surviving the Great Flood. He lives at the edge of the world with his wife, the only humans to have crossed permanently into the divine category of the undying. And when Gilgamesh finally reaches him after terrible hardship and asks how he too might achieve this translation from mortal to immortal, Utnapishtim's answer is devastating. It happened once. It will not happen again. The gods made an exception after the flood, granted immortality to the survivor and his wife. But this was a unique event tied to unique circumstances. There is no path that Gilgamesh can follow, no quest he can complete, no test he can pass. The door is closed. The age of such transformations is over. Utnapishtim does give Gilgamesh one chance, a plant at the bottom of the sea that can restore youth. But even this is taken from him when a serpent steals the plant while Gilgamesh bathes in a pool. He returns to Uruk empty-handed, immortality slipping through his fingers twice over, condemned to die like any common mortal despite the divine fire that burns uselessly within him. This is not just a story about the fear of death. This is a story about the closing of a door, the end of an age, the final settling of a prohibition that separates gods from humans permanently. Gilgamesh cannot become immortal because that transformation belongs to an era that has passed. His divine heritage is not enough. It might have been enough once. In earlier times when the mixing was fresh and the divine essence undiluted. But by his generation, the prohibition has taken effect. The bloodlines have thinned, and even 2/3 divine is not divine enough. And Gilgamesh is not alone in this tragedy. Look across the ancient world at the figures who occupy similar positions in their respective traditions. Beings of extraordinary power and beauty who know themselves to be something more than human, yet are doomed to mortality nonetheless. Achilles, in Greek tradition, son of the sea goddess Thetis and the mortal king Peleus, dipped in the river Styx by his mother in an attempt to make him immortal, but left with one vulnerable heel, that famous weakness that would eventually kill him. Achilles is the greatest warrior of his age, beautiful and terrible, nearly divine in his capabilities. But he knows from the beginning that his life will be short. He chooses glory over longevity, a brief, bright flame rather than a long, dim one, because he understands that immortality is not an option for him despite his divine mother. Thetis, a goddess, married a mortal and bore a mortal son. The divine essence did not pass in sufficient concentration to grant him what she has. He inherited her beauty, her power, her rage, but not her deathlessness. And so he burns across the Trojan battlefield, knowing that every day brings him closer to an end that his mother will have to witness. The goddess watching her hybrid child die while she continues forever. Or consider Cuchulainn of Irish tradition, the Hound of Ulster, son of the god Lugh and the mortal woman Daichtine. He possesses the warp spasm, a battle transformation that makes him virtually unstoppable, twisting his body into monstrous configurations of divine battle fury. He defends Ulster single-handedly against entire armies, performs feats that no mere human could accomplish, knows himself to be something other and something more. Yet he too is mortal. He knows prophecies foretell his early death, knows that his divine heritage has given him everything except duration, knows that he is burning through a brief life with intensity that compensates for its brevity. These figures, Gilgamesh, Achilles, Cuchulainn, and others like them scattered across the mythological traditions of the world, share a common existential position. They are children of a transition, beings who carry divine inheritance, but not enough of it. Powerful beyond ordinary mortals, but unable to transcend mortality itself. They rage against their condition in ways that purely human heroes do not. They seek immortality or glory or transcendence with a desperation that comes from knowing exactly what they are missing, from having tasted divinity without being able to swallow it whole. If the prohibition we have been tracing tonight is real, if there was indeed a moment when divine beings decided to stop interbreeding with humans, then these figures represent the generation immediately following that decision. They are the children of the last unions, the final products of a process that has been terminated, carrying the legacy of divine involvement in human affairs, but cut off from its source. No more divine parents will be born to human mothers. No more goddess will take mortal lovers. The stream of divine essence flowing into the human gene pool has been stopped, and these transitional beings must live out their lives, knowing they are the end of something, the last whispers of an age that will not return. Let your awareness settle now, sink deeper into your body, into the comfort of wherever you rest tonight. Feel your breath moving slowly in and out, the rhythm that connects you to everyone who has ever lived and breathed, mortal and perhaps once partly divine alike. The tragedy of the last hybrids is a very old tragedy, ancient by the time the tablets were pressed, and ancient again by the time we learned to read them. But it speaks to something in us still, some awareness that we too are children of transition, heirs to something we do not fully understand. Now consider what happened to the relationship between divine and human realms after the last hybrids had lived out their tragic lives. The prohibition did not simply end interbreeding. It transformed the entire nature of divine human contact, shifting it from intimate to distant, from physical to spiritual, from direct encounter to mediated communication. In the oldest texts, gods walked among humans. They ate at human tables, slept in human beds, spoke face to face with those they favored. Abraham in the Hebrew tradition argues with God directly, bargains with him over the fate of Sodom, entertains divine visitors in his tent, and feeds them bread and meat. These are stories of proximity, of relationship, of gods who are present in the human world in tangible ways. But as the texts progress through time, this proximity fades. Moses speaks to God but cannot see his face directly, only his back as he passes by. The glory of God is too dangerous for human eyes, too overwhelming for mortal perception. Later, prophets receive visions rather than visits, see symbols and images rather than divine faces, hear voices in dreams rather than in waking conversation. By the time of the later prophetic books, God communicates primarily through angels, through messengers, through intermediaries who carry divine words without being divine themselves. The contact has become remote, mediated, safe. Humans no longer risk the dangers of direct divine encounter because direct divine encounter no longer happens. This pattern appears not just in Hebrew tradition, but across the ancient world. The Greek gods of Homer's epics intervene constantly in human affairs, appearing to their favorites in disguise, fighting alongside them in battle, seducing them in various forms. But by the time of the classical philosophers, the gods have become abstract principles, forces of nature, ideas to be contemplated rather than beings to be encountered. The philosophers debate whether the traditional myths should be understood literally or allegorically, whether the gods truly took mortal lovers and fathered hybrid children, or whether these stories represent symbolic truths about the relationship between human and divine. The question itself reveals the transition. In Homer's time, no one asked whether Achilles was literally the son of a goddess. By Plato's time, such questions had become philosophically relevant because direct divine intervention had become rare or non-existent. Is what replaced the intimate relationship between divine and human. Priesthoods, rituals, sacrificial systems. If the gods would no longer come to human beds, perhaps they could be enticed to human altars. The elaborate temple complexes of the ancient world, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the temples of Egypt, the sanctuaries of Greece, all developed sophisticated systems for attracting divine attention, propitiating divine anger, maintaining divine favor. Priests became essential intermediaries, specialists in divine communication, the only humans trained and purified enough to approach the sacred spaces where gods might still occasionally manifest. The sacred marriage rituals we discussed earlier, the hieros gamos ceremonies where kings symbolically mated with priestesses representing goddesses, take on new meaning in this context. If divine beings no longer literally joined with humans in reproductive union, the ritual reenactment of such union might preserve some shadow of its power. The ceremony commemorates what once was real, maintains a connection that has become purely symbolic, keeps alive the memory of intimate divine-human contact even as that contact has ceased. Consider how different this is from the earlier pattern. In the time before the Prohibition, if such a time existed, divine heritage was biological, genetic, passed through blood and seed from parent to child. You were divine, or partially divine, because of who your parents were, because actual divine essence had entered your lineage through physical reproduction. But after the Prohibition, divine favor became a matter of worthiness rather than inheritance. You could not be born sacred, but you could become sacred through proper behavior, proper ritual, proper relationship with the divine, mediated through appropriate channels. The theology of sin and redemption that characterizes later religious traditions makes sense in this context. If you cannot inherit divine nature through blood, you must earn divine favor through action. If the gods will not come to your bed, you must go to their altars. If direct contact is impossible, mediated contact through prayer and sacrifice and ritual observance becomes essential. The entire structure of organized religion as we know it might be understood as a response to the Prohibition, an attempt to maintain some form of divine human relationship after the intimate biological relationship was terminated. We build temples because the gods no longer live among us. We perform sacrifices because we can no longer offer ourselves directly. We pray because we can no longer converse. We develop elaborate theological systems to explain why divine contact has become so rare and what we must do to deserve the occasional moment of connection. The mystics of every tradition report direct encounters with the divine, moments of union and communion that seem to recapture something of the old intimacy. But these are exceptional experiences, gifts of grace rather than birthright, temporary states rather than permanent inheritance. The mystic returns from the mountain or the cave or the depths of meditation to ordinary human life, carrying memories of divine contact but not divine blood. The prohibition holds even in the most intense spiritual experiences. We can touch the divine, perhaps, but we can no longer merge with it biologically, can no longer produce children who carry that merger into the next generation. The night deepens around you, and with it, perhaps a sense of loss, of something missing that you cannot quite name. This is appropriate for where we are in our journey, in the territory of aftermath, of absence, of learning to live with what remains when something essential has been withdrawn. But there is another side to this story, a perspective we have not yet fully considered, and it changes everything. What did humanity become after the prohibition took effect? What emerged from the generations that followed the last hybrids, the purely human or nearly purely human populations that inherited the earth after the divine withdrew? At first glance, the answer seems to be diminishment. We lost longevity, the 1,000-year lifespans of the antediluvian kings shrinking generation by generation to the mere decades we experience now. We lost direct divine contact, the conversations and visitations and intimate encounters replaced by silence and distance and the need for intermediaries. We lost whatever physical or mental capabilities divine heritage had conferred, strength or perception or knowledge that we can no longer access. The mythological record presents this as decline, as fall, as loss of a golden age that will not return. But there is another reading possible, another way to understand what the prohibition gave us rather than what it took away. Consider human creativity, that restless drive to make new things that characterizes our species in ways that seem unique. The gods in most mythological traditions are not creative in the way humans are. They are powerful, immortal, wise in the ways of maintaining cosmic order, but they do not invent. They do not innovate. They established the world and its patterns in the beginning, and have maintained those patterns ever since. Humans, by contrast, cannot stop creating. We build cities and then tear them down and build different cities. We develop technologies and then develop different technologies. We write stories and compose music and produce art with a prodigality that seems almost compulsive, as if something within us cannot rest. Where does this drive come from? Perhaps from the very separation that seems like loss. When the divine withdrew, when we could no longer rely on divine instruction or divine intervention, right? We had to figure things out for ourselves. We had to solve problems that the gods would once have solved for us. We had to innovate or die, adapt or perish, create new solutions, because the old divine solutions were no longer available. The Tower of Babel's story in the Hebrew tradition suggests exactly this dynamic. Humanity, in the generations after the flood, decides to build a tower reaching to heaven, to storm the divine realm through purely human effort. God responds by confusing their languages and scattering them across the earth, but the impulse itself is significant. Humans, deprived of divine connection, attempted to create their own connection through architecture, through technology, through sheer ambitious construction. The attempt failed, but the ambition did not disappear. It simply redirected into other channels, other forms of reaching, other ways of becoming godlike through our own efforts. Consider the Prometheus myth from Greek tradition. Prometheus, a titan rather than an Olympian god, steals fire from the divine realm and gives it to humanity against the explicit wishes of Zeus. For this transgression, he is punished terribly, chained to a rock where an eagle eats his liver daily, only for it to regenerate each night, so the torment can continue forever. But humanity keeps the fire. We gain technology, craft, the ability to shape our environment rather than simply endure it. The gift comes with a price, both for Prometheus and for us, but it transforms us into something more than mere animals. The myth suggests that human technological development began as theft from the divine, acquisition of capabilities that gods wished to monopolize. But it also suggests that once we had those capabilities, they were ours to develop and expand. Prometheus gave us fire, but we invented everything that followed: metallurgy and chemistry and electronics and nuclear power, the long elaboration of that original divine spark through purely human innovation. Perhaps this is what the Prohibition ultimately accomplished. By cutting us off from direct divine support, it forced us to develop capacities we would never have developed while dependent on divine guidance. We became inventors because we had to. We became explorers because no one would tell us what lay beyond the horizon. We became scientists because the gods would no longer explain how the universe worked, and we desperately wanted to know. The entire trajectory of human civilization, from stone tools to spacecraft, might be understood as compensation for divine withdrawal. The long effort to recreate through our own efforts the powers we lost when the gods stopped sharing their essence with us. And perhaps there is something else, something harder to name, but equally important. When the divine withdrew, when we became purely or nearly purely human, we gained something that hybrid beings could never have. We gained autonomy. We gained the terrible freedom of beings who must make their own choices without divine direction, who must construct their own meanings without divine revelation, who must face mortality without divine exemption. The last hybrids, Gilgamesh and Achilles and their kind, were tragic precisely because they were caught between worlds, partly divine enough to want immortality, but not divine enough to achieve it. Their condition was inherently unstable, unsatisfying, a permanent reminder of what they almost were, but could never fully become. But purely human beings face no such divided condition. We know what we are. We know we will die. We know that no divine blood flows in our veins sufficient to change this fundamental fact. And in that knowledge, terrible as it is, there is a kind of freedom. We do not wait for divine intervention because we know it will not come. We do not expect immortality because we know it is not ours to claim. We must make meaning in the time we have, must love knowing that love ends, must build knowing that buildings crumble, must live knowing that life is brief. This is the human condition, perhaps, as it was always meant to be. Perhaps the long age of divine human interbreeding was a developmental phase, necessary for a time, but meant to end. Perhaps the prohibition was not punishment, but graduation, not rejection, but release. Perhaps the gods withdrew precisely so that we could become what we were always meant to become, not hybrid dependence on divine favor, but autonomous beings capable of determining our own path. The irony, if this reading is correct, is profound. We became capable of godlike achievements precisely because the gods withdrew. We developed our astonishing technologies, built our civilizations, reached toward the stars, because we could no longer rely on divine assistance. The prohibition that seemed like abandonment may have been the essential precondition for everything we have since accomplished. And perhaps this is why the texts preserve both the memory of divine intimacy and the reality of divine withdrawal. But we needed to know what we came from in order to understand what we were becoming. We needed the stories of the last hybrids, their tragic power and their ultimate failure to transcend mortality, so that we could make peace with our own purely mortal condition. We needed to remember the age of gods and humans mingling so that we could appreciate the age of humans alone, making our way without divine direction, building our own Tower of Babel, not to storm heaven, but to understand earth. The gods may return. The myths of many traditions suggest they will at the end of this age, at the turning of the great cycle, when the conditions that prompted the prohibition no longer obtain. But until then, perhaps for thousands of years yet, we are on our own. And being on our own has made us what we are. New, creative and restless and mortal and magnificent. The children of divine withdrawal becoming something the gods themselves might not have imagined when they closed the doors of heaven and left us to find our own way home. The fragment still rests in its climate-controlled drawer in the basement of the museum, waiting in the darkness beneath the galleries where tourists wander past displays of more photogenic artifacts. And if you could descend those stairs tonight, if you could pull open that drawer and lift the clay piece into your hands, you would feel the weight of it, surprisingly heavy for something so small, and you would see the cuneiform impressions still sharp after 4,000 years, the wedge shapes pressed into wet clay by a scribe who believed he was recording something essential, something that must not be forgotten. And the miracle is not what the tablet says, but that it exists at all. That this fragile piece of earth survived the burning of Nineveh, survived the collapse of empires, survived millennia of burial beneath sand and rubble, survived the excavation and the shipping and the cataloguing, survived wars and floods, and the simple grinding passage of time to arrive here in this moment where you can contemplate its existence even if you will never touch it. And what it preserves is not just words, but questions, not just a record, but a mystery, a message in a bottle thrown across an ocean of centuries by someone who could not have imagined you, but who nonetheless was writing to you, was preserving this fragment of divine decision for whoever might eventually find it and wonder. And the chain of transmission stretches from that ancient hand pressing stylus into clay through the generations of scribes who copied and recopied, through the priests who stored the tablets in temple libraries, through the soldiers who burned those libraries, not knowing they were firing the clay into permanent ceramic, through the earth that covered and preserved, through the archaeologists who dug and brushed and catalogued, through the scholars who deciphered and debated, through the authors who wrote and the readers who read, all the way to you, lying here in the dark, breathing slowly, carrying this knowledge into the threshold of sleep. And the question is not what you are supposed to do with this information, not how you are supposed to solve the puzzle or prove the theory or convince the skeptics. The question is simpler and deeper than that. The question is how you will live with the not knowing, how you will carry the mystery without needing to resolve it, how you will let the questions transform you even if the answers never come. Because perhaps that was always the gift hidden inside the prohibition. Perhaps when the gods withdrew from our beds and our bloodlines, they were giving us something we could not have received any other way: the space to become ourselves, the freedom to make our own mistakes and our own discoveries, the dignity of a species that must find its own path without divine hands guiding every step. And yes, there is loneliness in that freedom. Yes, there is grief in the separation. Yes, we wake sometimes in the darkest hours with a longing. We cannot name for a presence we cannot remember. But there is also something else, something that looks remarkably like maturity, like the moment when children leave the house of their parents and discover they are capable of building houses of their own. And maybe the prohibition was not punishment for our unworthiness, but graduation into a new phase of existence. Maybe the gods looked at what their hybrid children were becoming and realized that continued intervention would prevent us from becoming what we needed to become. Maybe the divine withdrawal was the hardest gift imaginable, the gift of being left alone to discover what we truly were and what we were. What we are, what we are still becoming, is something unprecedented, something the universe had never seen before. A species capable of godlike achievements without godlike lifespans. A species that knows it will die and creates anyway, that sees the void and builds fires against it, that inherits fragments of cosmic mystery and does not despair but wonders. And perhaps that wondering is itself the inheritance, perhaps the capacity to lie here in the dark, contemplating questions that have no answers, is the very thing the gods were trying to create all along. And if so, then the prohibition was not an ending, but a beginning, not a door closing, but a door opening onto something vast and terrifying and beautiful. And now, as your breathing slows and your body grows heavy, and the boundary between waking and sleeping dissolves like mist in morning light, let these questions settle into the depths of your mind, where dreams do their strange, transforming work. Let the ancient scribe and the Akkadian clay and the divine council and the last hybrids and the long millennia of separation all drift into that space between knowing and unknowing, where the deepest truths sometimes surface. And know that whatever heritage flows in your blood, whatever fragment of the divine might still flicker in your consciousness, whatever you lost and whatever you gained when the gods stopped coming to us, you are here now, alive, aware, wondering. And that is enough. That is the gift. That is what remains when everything else has crumbled to dust and blown away on winds older than any god. The simple, persistent miracle of a mind contemplating its own origins, reaching backward through time toward hands that once reached forward. And in that reaching, in that wondering, in that refusal to stop asking questions even when the answers will never come, something sacred survives, something the prohibition could not erase, something that connects you to every human who ever looked up at the stars and asked who made us and why and what comes next. And with that connection holding you gently like a hand in the darkness, with the fragment still waiting in its drawer and the questions still burning softly in your mind, and the whole long story of divine creation and divine withdrawal and human becoming still unfinished, still unfolding, still reaching towards some resolution we cannot yet imagine. Let yourself drift now into the quiet spaces where sleep awaits. Let the night hold you as the gods once held our ancestors. Let go of the need to understand and simply rest in the mystery. And know that when you wake, the world will still be waiting with all its fragments and all its questions and all its strange, impossible beauty. And you will be there to meet it, carrying traces of something ancient in every cell of your body and every thought in your dreaming mind. Sleep well, wanderer. Sleep well, child of the stars and the clay, and the choices made in temples long since fallen. Sleep well and dream. Whatever dreams still connect us to what we were before the gods withdrew, and wake when you are ready into the strange gift of being purely, finally, magnificently human. Good night.